Standing in the freezing Nashville air while watching my family celebrate felt like a final brutal awakening from a 30-year dream that I could ever truly belong among them. I am Sadie Miller, currently 30 years old, and this Christmas morning didn't just ruin my holiday, but effectively severed the final threads of loyalty I held toward the people I called my family. My older sister Josephine let out a piercing scream of pure delight as she gripped the keys to a brand new, shimmering white BMW worth $55,000. My father beamed with a pride he had never once directed toward my engineering career, while my mother handed me a battered, rusted bicycle from our old garage. Inside a small envelope taped to the handlebars sat a single crisp $1 bill, which felt more like a calculated insult than any legitimate attempt at a holiday gift. My mother leaned in with a warm, terrifyingly sincere smile to tell me that this pathetic dollar was their official contribution toward my future home. I stood there in complete silence before realizing that my years of silent financial support had been rewarded with nothing but mockery and utter contempt. I didn't argue or cry because I simply went upstairs to pack my life into 2 suitcases before driving away without a single word of goodbye. As the city lights of Nashville faded in my rearview mirror, my phone buzzed with a message that proved they didn't even realize I was gone for good. Before I reveal the devastating aftermath of my departure and how their world crumbled without my hidden help, I want to ask you a quick question. Please let me know in the comments what time it is and which city you are watching from right now, so I can see how far my story has traveled. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell because you absolutely do not want to miss the moment my family realized exactly what they lost when they handed me that dollar bill. The psychological architecture of the Miller household had always been constructed upon a foundation of blatant inequality that everyone except me seemed perfectly comfortable navigating throughout our lives. Growing up in the suburbs of Nashville meant maintaining a facade of middle-class perfection, while the internal dynamics were rotting under the weight of my parents' obsession with Josephine. Since we were children, my sister was treated like a fragile masterpiece that required constant shielding from the harsh realities of effort, while I was cast as the indestructible pillar meant to support the structure. Whenever I brought home straight A's from my demanding engineering courses, Calvin would give a distracted nod before returning his full attention to Josephine's latest dramatic failure in her pottery class. They called me the independent one to justify their emotional neglect and used my self-sufficiency as an excuse to redirect every available resource toward my sister's whims. While I was working 2 jobs during my time at Vanderbilt University to cover the gap in my partial scholarship, my parents were financing Josephine's 3rd attempt at a fashion degree that she eventually abandoned without a second thought. My professional success as a civil engineer was never celebrated with a dinner or a toast, because Florence claimed that my high salary was its own reward and therefore required no further acknowledgement. This dynamic created a toxic environment where my contributions were harvested like a natural resource, while Josephine's existence was pampered as if she were royalty. My sister developed a sharpened sense of entitlement that allowed her to look down on my hard work, even as she spent the money our parents had essentially diverted from my childhood savings. There were countless nights when I sat at the dinner table listening to them discuss her bright future while I was treated like an unpaid consultant whose only value was providing logical solutions to their self-inflicted problems. Florence would often pat my hand and remind me that I was the strong daughter who didn't need anything, effectively silencing any attempt I made to express my own needs or desires. This long-standing pattern of invisibility became the cage I lived in for 3 decades until I finally realized that my strength was being weaponized against me. Josephine never had to worry about a car payment or a utility bill because she knew that Calvin and Florence would move mountains to ensure her comfort at any cost. My parents viewed my stability as a safety net for the entire family, which allowed them to take massive financial risks without ever consulting me about the potential consequences. I had become the silent benefactor of a lifestyle that excluded my happiness while prioritizing the vanity of a sister who had never earned a single dollar of her own. The realization that I was being drained of my vitality to fuel their collective delusion was a slow poison that finally reached my heart on that cold Christmas morning in Tennessee. I watched them exchange glances of shared secret joy while I stood in the corner of the living room, feeling like a ghost haunting my own home. Every sacrifice I had made over the years flashed before my eyes as I looked at the shimmering BMW through the window, and then back at the rusted metal of the bicycle they thought was a suitable reward for my loyalty. The air in the room felt heavy with the unspoken truth that I was merely a guest in their lives, a person whose presence was tolerated only as long as I remained useful and silent. It was in that moment of profound clarity that I understood the true depth of the betrayal that had been brewing for years under the guise of family tradition. 4 months before that devastating Christmas morning, I accidentally discovered the true extent of the financial house of cards that my father had built to sustain Josephine's extravagant lifestyle. While I was visiting the house to help Calvin organize some tax documents, I stumbled upon a thick envelope from the bank that had been hidden under a pile of old magazines in his home office. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the bold red letters indicating a final notice for a second mortgage that I never even knew existed on our family home. The documents revealed that my parents had leveraged the equity of the house to provide Josephine with a massive cash injection for a boutique business venture that had collapsed within 6 weeks. Instead of admitting their mistake, my father had taken out even more high-interest personal loans to cover the initial debt while keeping the entire situation a secret from me. I sat in the dim light of the office realizing that the very roof over their heads was at risk because they couldn't say no to my sister's constant demands for more. Later that evening, I overheard Florence whispering to Calvin in the kitchen about how they would eventually have to ask me for a significant lump sum to prevent the bank from initiating foreclosure proceedings. They weren't worried about the debt itself, but rather how to manipulate my sense of duty to ensure that I would bail them out without asking too many questions about where the money went. It became sickeningly clear that they were planning to use my hard-earned savings as a sacrificial lamb to protect Josephine from the consequences of her own incompetence. My sister, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware, or perhaps intentionally ignorant of the ruin she was causing as she scrolled through luxury car websites during dinner. She had the audacity to complain about the color of the leather interior in the BMW she was eyeing, while our father's hands shook with the stress of the mounting interest rates. I watched Calvin force a smile and promise her that she would have the best vehicle in Nashville because a girl of her stature deserved nothing less than perfection. The cognitive dissonance of the situation was staggering as I realized that my parents were willing to become homeless just to maintain the illusion that Josephine was a successful socialite. I felt a surge of cold fury realizing that every dollar I had ever given them for emergencies had likely been funneled directly into Josephine's bottomless pit of vanity. They viewed my bank account as an extension of their own and assumed that my love for them would blind me to their blatant financial abuse. I decided to remain silent about my discovery for the time being, because I wanted to see exactly how far they would go before they finally tried to squeeze the money out of me. It was a cruel social experiment where I was the subject and my family members were the unwitting participants in their own downfall. Josephine continued to brag about her upcoming brand launch, while I knew for a fact that the bank was preparing to send a representative to appraise the house for a potential sale. The tension in the house was palpable to me, but my parents were so blinded by their favoritism that they truly believed they could keep the charade going forever. I started to notice small details like the way Florence would flinch when the phone rang, or how Calvin avoided eye contact whenever the topic of retirement came up. They were drowning in a sea of their own making, and instead of reaching for a lifeline, they were trying to pull me under the waves with them. Throughout the last 2 years of my life in Nashville, I had been the invisible engine keeping the Miller family from total collapse by managing all their essential expenses through a complex system of automated payments. My parents were under the impression that their modest pensions were somehow covering the skyrocketing costs of living in a rapidly gentrifying city, while I was actually the one paying for everything. I had set up direct debits from my personal account for the electricity, the heating, the high-speed internet, and even the comprehensive insurance policies that protected their aging health. Calvin would often brag at neighborhood barbecues about how he was a master of budgeting and how he had cracked the code to financial freedom in his golden years. I would stand there holding a paper plate of cold potato salad and listen to him lie to our friends while my bank account was being drained of nearly $2,000 every single month. Florence never questioned why the lights stayed on or why the pantry was always full of premium groceries, because she simply assumed that the universe owed her a comfortable life for being a good mother. They treated my financial contributions as if they were a natural force like gravity, something that existed without effort and required no gratitude or even basic acknowledgement. Josephine would frequently mock my boring corporate job and my unfashionable habit of packing my lunch for work while she was literally eating food purchased with my money. She once had the nerve to tell me that I lacked the creative spark necessary to truly enjoy life, and that I should try being more spontaneous like her. I wanted to scream at her that my lack of spontaneity was the only reason she wasn't sleeping on a park bench, but I held my tongue and continued to pay the bills in silence. My parents had become so accustomed to my quiet support that they actually started to resent me for not providing even more luxury for the family. Florence once complained that I hadn't offered to pay for the professional landscaping she wanted for the backyard, even though I was already paying for the property taxes they had neglected. They had successfully decoupled the reality of their survival from the person who was actually ensuring it, which allowed them to treat me with increasing levels of disdain. It was a bizarre dynamic where the more I helped them, the less they respected me because my assistance was so seamless and reliable that it became invisible to their selfish eyes. I watched as they spent their actual income on designer clothes for Josephine and expensive dinners for her various boyfriends, while I was calculating how many more overtime hours I needed to cover their next insurance premium. The resentment began to fester in my chest, like a slow-burning ember, as I realized that I was enabling their dysfunction and fueling their arrogance with every cent I spent on them. I kept waiting for a moment of recognition, a simple thank you, or a genuine question about how I was managing my own finances, but it never came. Instead, they would ask me to pick up the tab for family outings because Sadie has the big engineering salary, while they saved their cash to buy Josephine a new designer handbag for her birthday. They had turned my success into a weapon of my own enslavement, and they were enjoying every second of the comfort I provided without ever feeling the need to offer me a seat at the head of the table. I realized that as long as I kept the lights on, they would never have to face the truth of their own failure, and they would never have to see me as a human being with my own dreams. Just 1 hour after the most humiliating Christmas lunch of my life, I found myself standing in my childhood bedroom realizing that every second I stayed in that house was a second I was choosing to be a victim. I moved with a mechanical precision that surprised even me as I dragged my heavy suitcases from the back of the closet and began filling them with everything I truly valued. I didn't take the cheap department store sweater my parents had given me, or the impersonal candles from my cousins, because I wanted to leave every trace of their fake affection behind in that room. My heart was a block of ice as I sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled up my banking app on my phone with hands that were finally steady after hours of shaking. I felt a surge of cold power as I navigated through the settings and began systematically deleting every single automated payment instruction I had set up over the last 2 years. With a few taps, I severed the financial umbilical cord that had been keeping the Miller household alive as I canceled the electricity, the water, the gas, and the premium internet subscriptions. I didn't stop there because I also called the insurance company and informed them that I was withdrawing my payment method from my parents' policies effective immediately. The realization that the house would be plunged into darkness and cold within days gave me a sense of grim satisfaction that I hadn't felt in years. I walked downstairs carrying my luggage and past the living room, where Josephine was currently taking selfies in front of the Christmas tree with her new BMW keys prominently displayed. None of them looked up as I crossed the hallway, because they were all too busy basking in the glow of the expensive gift that my labor had indirectly financed. I reached the kitchen and placed a single sheet of paper on the counter where I had written a very clear message about my permanent departure and the end of my financial support. I didn't offer any apologies or long-winded explanations because the rusted bicycle in the driveway and the $1 bill in my pocket said everything that needed to be said. I walked out the front door and threw that pathetic dollar bill onto the driveway as I climbed into my own car, which I had worked 3 years of overtime to buy. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked at the bicycle leaning against the porch and felt a strange sense of gratitude for it because it had finally shown me the truth. I drove toward the interstate heading away from Nashville and toward the guest room of my best friend Quinn, who had been telling me for years to stop letting my family bleed me dry. I hadn't even reached the city limits when my phone began to vibrate in the center console with an incoming text message from Florence. I expected a question about where I was going or an apology for the gift, but instead it was a cold reminder to make sure I paid the property tax bill that was due on the 28th. I stared at the screen in utter disbelief as the audacity of her demand hit me like a physical blow, and I realized that she truly saw me as nothing more than a walking checkbook. I didn't reply, but I did take a screenshot of the message as a permanent reminder of why I could never return to that house or that family. The road ahead was dark, and the Nashville weather was turning into a bitter storm, but for the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly free. 10 days after I disappeared from Nashville and effectively vanished from the family's daily life, the reality of my absence began to manifest in ways that my parents were completely unprepared to handle. The first sign of trouble was the sudden and total loss of electricity during one of the coldest weeks of the Tennessee winter, because the grace period for the unpaid bill had finally expired. Florence had called me 30 times in a single afternoon with messages that progressed from mild irritation to hysterical screaming as she demanded to know why the lights wouldn't turn on. She didn't ask if I was safe or where I was living, but instead she ranted about how I was being irresponsible and immature for letting a simple bill slip through the cracks. While she was screaming into my voicemail, a team from the local bank and a repossession crew were pulling into their driveway to take back Josephine's white BMW. It turned out that the special surprise car my father had gifted her was only possible through a high-interest bridge loan that required a massive balloon payment which he simply didn't have. Calvin had been banking on me providing the cash to cover that payment as part of my contribution to the family, but since I was gone, the bank didn't hesitate to reclaim their asset. I watched a video sent by a curious neighbor of Josephine standing in the driveway in her pajamas, screaming at the tow truck driver, while the BMW was hoisted into the air and driven away. The humiliation was absolute as the entire neighborhood witnessed the collapse of the Miller family's grand illusion of wealth in real time. My father tried to call my workplace to demand that my boss give him my new address, but he was informed that I had already transferred to a different branch and had requested a total privacy block. The financial dominoes continued to fall as the insurance on their house lapsed, and the bank moved forward with the foreclosure process because the mortgage hadn't been paid in 3 months. I received one final email from Calvin that was filled with such venom and hatred that it permanently shattered any remaining desire I had for a reconciliation. He called me a traitor to my own blood and accused me of trying to kill my mother with stress just because I was jealous of a car. He couldn't even, in his moment of total ruin, admit that they had done anything wrong or that they had treated me with anything less than perfect love. They were so deeply entrenched in their own narcissism that they viewed my self-preservation as an act of unprovoked aggression against their lifestyle. Josephine, meanwhile, had to move into a tiny studio apartment and take a job as a dishwasher because she had no skills and no one left to pay her way. The boutique business she had dreamed of was gone, and her social media followers disappeared as soon as she stopped posting photos of luxury cars and expensive brunches. My parents were forced to sell off their remaining furniture and move into a state-subsidized senior living facility because they had no savings and no house left to their name. The destruction of their lives was swift and brutal, but it was entirely the result of their own greed and their refusal to see me as a human being. I realized that by cutting them off, I hadn't just saved myself, but I had finally forced them to face the consequences of the reality they had tried to ignore for decades. 1 year has passed since that cold morning in Nashville, when I finally decided that my worth was not a commodity to be traded for my family's conditional approval. I have successfully built a new life in a city where nobody knows me as the reliable one or the invisible daughter who pays for everyone else's mistakes. I bought a small but beautiful house with a garden that I maintain myself, and every time I walk through the front door, I am reminded that I earned every single brick of it. My career as a civil engineer has flourished because I finally have the mental energy to focus on my own goals instead of constantly solving the financial disasters of my parents. I haven't spoken to Calvin, Florence, or Josephine in over 14 months, and while there is still a dull ache in my heart, it is nothing compared to the sharp pain of being exploited. I heard through a distant relative that they are still blaming me for their downfall and telling anyone who will listen that I am a cold-hearted monster who abandoned them in their time of need. It no longer bothers me because I have realized that their opinion of me was never based on who I actually am, but rather on how much they could get out of me. I am surrounded by friends who value my time and my heart, and I have finally learned how to say no without feeling a crushing weight of guilt in my chest. This journey has taught me that blood might make you related, but only respect and genuine love make you a family, and I refuse to settle for anything less ever again. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of my story and for listening to the most difficult chapter of my life. If you have ever felt like you were the invisible pillar holding up a house that didn't even want to give you a room, I hope my story gives you the strength to walk away. You are not a resource to be mined, and your success belongs to you alone, regardless of what anyone else tries to tell you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop being the safety net for people who would never even think to catch you if you were the one falling. I would truly love to hear your thoughts on my decision. And if you have ever faced a similar situation with your own family, in the comments section below. Do you think I was too harsh in cutting them off so suddenly? Or was it the only way to finally make them see the truth of their actions? Your support and your stories mean the world to me. So please don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about finding strength in the face of betrayal and building a life on your own terms. Remember that you are the architect of your own future, and you have every right to choose who gets to live in the world you are building for yourself. Goodbye for now, and I hope your own journey is filled with the respect and the genuine love